pretty off the cuff. I want to say right now that I have not scripted this. I literally just 5 minutes ago finished reading this article and some of the comments, and I was like, this is such a great topic. There's so much good conversation happening in the comments, and I just wanted to start this discussion with you guys and get your thoughts on it because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm just super curious to hear what you all think. So the title of the article, which I'm gonna link in a pinned comment down below and also in the description of this video, it's on Writer Unboxed, and it's called "To Warn or Not to Warn: The Controversy Around Trigger Warnings in Literature." This article is written by author Jamie Beck, who has published, I think, like 18 something novels. So Jamie says she has a book coming out that has a neurodiverse character. Her publisher engaged a sensitivity reader, and in addition to giving her notes on that character, the reader recommended trigger warnings for a few particular things. I won't be saying these things out loud because I think we all know generally what acts receive trigger warnings, and I don't need to say them. Kind of maybe ironically, maybe I just don't want to put trigger warnings on this video. Jamie says, most everyone knows that a trigger warning is essentially a statement cautioning a consumer or reader that the content may be disturbing or induce a traumatic response. Although these labels are not as commonplace in publishing as they are in film, television, and music, in recent years they've begun to appear on a book's digital detail page, its back jacket, or in an author's note. The big argument in favor of such labels is they give the reader the choice to avoid a book that contains material said reader might find harmful or that could unwittingly force them to visit a past trauma. And I will go ahead and say that, like, I don't know when trigger warnings and content warnings really started to rise, but I do remember years and years ago when I first started hearing about them, my initial thought was, okay, I mean, what's the harm? Why not go ahead and put a trigger warning, not just on your book, but on your blog post or whatever that you're about to put up. It can, if it's gonna help someone choose whether or not to consume whatever it is you're putting out there, then it's just such a simple thing to do that was my initial thought. Why not? Okay. She goes on to say, while I consider myself to be a compassionate person who would never purposely cause someone harm, my initial reaction was to reject the suggestion. So that's interesting. Her initial reaction was different than mine. Trust me, I know that sounds awful, but I was worried the warnings somewhat mischaracterized the tone and themes in my work. After all, if A Man Called Ove had included a particular warning, many people might have missed out on an extremely life-affirming story. I discussed my concern with my agent and editor, both of whom expressed their doubts about the necessity of these warnings. I think that's a really great point, and just personal experience, I have found the opposite also to be true. Olive in the Backstage Ghost, I have talked to you guys about this many times in the past, but I'm very proud of this book. I would not change anything in this book. If I could go back, I have no regrets about the story. However, the publisher decided on both a title and cover that I repeatedly said I felt lightened the themes of the book and did not accurately portray how dark things got on the inside. And sure enough, when it came out, many reviews were like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. This is too dark for my tastes. And they meant that in a negative way. They did not enjoy the book because it was not the story they wanted to read. So while that doesn't have anything to do with trigger warnings, I do overall, just as a blanket statement, I think the cover, your overall marketing language, and yes, your trigger warnings should accurately reflect what is in your book. And I can understand totally what she means about how, you know, this might have a complete opposite effect. Like, there might just be a small mention of whatever in your book, but the trigger warning makes the reader potentially think there are like chapters devoted to this, or like there's an explicit scene of this certain thing and there's not, and then they avoid your book, but it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. I told you guys I didn't script this. This is what happens when I don't script. I ramble. So Jamie goes on to talk about a article that she read in the New Yorker called "What If Trigger Warnings Don't Work?", which discusses studies conducted with respect to the effectiveness of content warnings in academia, which are on the rise. And the data suggests that such warnings not only don't work, but they may inflict more harm by causing additional stress and reinforcing the idea that a trauma is central to a survivor's identity, which is the opposite of PTSD therapy goals. On Twitter and in an Authors Guild discussion thread on this topic, more than one licensed therapist concurred with the article's conclusions and believed trigger warnings had no meaningful effect. Again, I knew nothing about this. I will link that New Yorker article below, but she just goes on to continue kind of exploring these two ideas. Are we doing more harm than good with trigger warnings? She talks about some other debates on common pitfalls of trigger warnings, which include spoilers, obviously. A simplistic and popular complaint is that a content warning may give away a plot twist and thus spoil the story for every reader, which is especially frustrating for those who didn't want the warning. This camp argues that prior to purchase, a sensitive reader can visit websites such as Book Trigger Warnings or Trigger Warning Database to verify whether a particular book contains the troubling content, and I will link those websites down below as well because I didn't know that they existed, and that's a pretty great resource. The next is trigger identification. There are as many different triggers as there are readers, making it a practical impossibility to adequately warn every potential reader about every potential trigger. Similarly, readers with comparable experiences may have different reactions and preferences. For example, I was raised in a violent home but did not want or need a warning before reading The Great Alone. We can certainly group some content into broad common categories like domestic abuse, addiction, etc. But what about a reader who might be traumatized by something more obscure like a color or a setting? It seems ambitious, if not impossible, to imagine one could create a list of all possible triggers. If we can't screen every scenario, is it fair to screen any? So, like I said, years ago when I first started seeing trigger warnings popping up everywhere, my initial reaction was, okay, why not? Then I started seeing call-outs online of, you talked about this thing in your video or your article or blog post or whatever, and that's potentially triggering, and basically kind of like shaking their finger at the writer or creator of that content. But the thing they were calling out was like a pretty obscure trigger. It would be easy to overlook or not think about the fact that this might trigger someone. And I'm seeing that more and more over the last few years, I feel like. And also, the word trigger in itself has just like become so, I don't know, politicized for sure, and just, on the one hand, it's used often to just make fun of people for being overly sensitive, and on the other hand, I have seen people like genuinely, non-ironically say, this triggered me, but when they describe the situation they're talking about, what they really just mean is, it made me upset. And that's not the same thing when we're talking about a person with PTSD who might literally be forced to relive a traumatic experience from their past. For example, a war veteran, because of a certain sound or a certain, incident. Those aren't different things. It doesn't just mean this upset me, And so all of that all together has kind of got me thinking more about that last point. Like, we can't include them all. That's impossible based on how people are starting to define triggers. So should we do any? I don't know. I never actually thought about, should we just not do any trigger warnings ever? Because I still think that there are certain triggering, potential ideas, scenes that we all know that are easy to just say, hey, this book includes mention of or ideation of or a graphic act of blank. Like, that's easy enough to include. I don't know, but I do understand the point. If it's, I don't like the phrase slippery slope that much, but I can understand how it's like, well, if you're going to put a trigger warning for this, why didn't you put a trigger warning for this and this and this and this and this? And then that brings me to, this was kind of like the natural evolution of how I was thinking about it, and that is genre expectations. In dark romance, for example, it is almost guaranteed there will be some level of violence and crime, such as kidnapping the heroine or dubious consent. The same could be said of crime novels and thrillers. Should authors and publishers need to take additional steps to prepare a reader for something that is essentially foundational to that genre? And that is going to bring us into something that I think is a really important part of this discussion, which is just self-management and the individual ultimately being responsible for their own triggers. And I feel like even that sounds harsher than I mean it to. We'll get into this a little bit more later. But yeah, basically, if I'm picking up a horror novel, I'm not going to be surprised by horror elements. And if I'm in a place where I feel like certain things that are commonly found in horror are going to be damaging to my mental health, I am not going to pick up that horror novel. Simple as that. And then finally we have censorship. Some teachers, librarians, and publishing professionals argue that content labels are a form of censorship and that the line between labels and trigger warnings is thin. They worry an overreach or abuse of these labels could result in many books being segregated onto separate shelves. For example, YA books often tackle an array of topics, and if the use of multiple warnings persists and leads to segregated shelving, those books might become less visible and accessible to the general public who might otherwise benefit from exploring those topics. This slippery slope could also ultimately affect what stories publishers choose to invest in and distribute, which would be bad for both authors and readers. I'm always a little wary when censorship is brought up nowadays because so many people just don't use it right, like look up the actual definition of the word. But in this case, I can understand kind of what they're saying and where they're going with this. I mean, we see, certain thematic topics in novels being used to promote them, especially in children's sections, like here is a table with books that feature this. I can also see that having kind of an opposite effect where maybe some booksellers are more prone to saying, this book has this content warning, so we're not going to feature it as heavily. I don't know. I mean, I would love to hear some booksellers and just marketing experts weigh in on this. And if you think this is like kind of a likely or potential scenario that could happen, like we kind of roll down the hill further into censorship because of trigger warnings, or if they contribute to that in some way, I need to give this a lot more thought. But yeah, just a really interesting point that I had not considered. Now, here is the conclusion that this author came to regarding whether or not to include a trigger warning in this particular case for this particular book. If I value the privilege of having strangers let my words into their hearts, I must build and protect a trusting relationship with them. That bond cannot exist if I'm unwilling to do my part to ensure that they don't accidentally purchase content they might find traumatic. I won't attempt to create an exhaustive list of every potential trigger in my next release, but I can take the sensitivity reader's suggestion. While I'm certain that the decision to add this notice in the author's note will result in some readers choosing not to pick up this particular story, I'm equally certain that it is better to lose those readers for this one book rather than to hurt and lose them for all future books. My personal choice, however, does not resolve the bigger questions about censorship, spoilers, or whether such warnings do more harm than good. And then we get into a just really, and how often do I get to say this, respectful and nuanced discussion in the comments section. This just does not happen on the internet very often. And I really want to highlight the first comment, and a lot of other people mentioned it as well. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very long, but I really enjoyed this particular part in the middle. She says, I have purchased and put down many books that weren't to my taste, ranging from gratuitous graphic violence to too many randomly repeated words. Literary abuse to me. I am an editor after all. And do not feel duped. It's simply the way of it with books. If someone feels endangered while reading a book, they can put it down in like fashion. I just quit watching the movie musical Matilda because I couldn't bear one more scene of child abuse. My choice. I do not expect an author or director to protect my mental health. That's on me every minute of every day. I do not expect or want to be warned. Despite my general disinterest in gore, the disembowelment of William Wallace was a powerfully moving, earned scene at the end of Braveheart that I would have missed had I been reading it in a book that came with a trigger warning. Trigger warnings seem a breath away from a rating system, which feels another breath away from censorship, in my opinion. I'm not a fan. I want to say this one part again because it really kind of hit me. I do not expect an author or director to protect my mental health. That's on me every minute of every day. I do find myself generally agreeing with this, and I know I've discussed this in other videos when I'm asked about writing for children in particular and how scary is too scary for kids. And my answer is always this. In my experience as a teacher, having taught writing workshops, and over the course of like 7 years, I taught over 1,000 kids, hundreds of workshops, right? These kids are writing all different kinds of topics, And some of them were ready for certain types of more mature content and others weren't. And oh my gosh, without fail, every time they were so good at self-regulating. They were so good at knowing, and not just the stories they were writing and what they were sharing with each other, but with the books they read, because we talk about books a lot in these workshops. They were so good at self-regulating, like when it came to violence, when it came to any kind of horror or scary situations, when it came to romance, when it came to sex. They knew when they were ready for certain things, and they knew when something wasn't for them yet. Kids are just remarkably good at this kind of self-regulation, and I think we need to have some trust in them when it comes to both what they write and what they read. I'm not saying parents shouldn't be involved in what their children read, of course you should, but I think that there's no one blanket statement like, oh, this is 100% too scary for all children, or this is 100% totally safe for all children. You don't know what's gonna scare a kid. And anyway, I don't want to get off topic here, but I understood what she was saying in that comment, because I do think ultimately it is up to us. And I think that for a person who has a traumatic event in their past and they are, in counseling, they are getting therapy, they are recovering from it, they know how to manage it, it would feel, I would think, disempowering to just expect the entire world to become your safe space when you know that's never actually going to happen. And I'm not saying that to make an excuse for not using trigger warnings, but I find it more empowering for the individual person to be like, I know I can put this book down at any time. And when I think about this, I think about a lot of reviews I've read. When I finish reading a book, whether I really enjoyed it or I really didn't, sometimes I like to go on Goodreads and see if other reviewers, like, what their thoughts were and if they had similar thoughts to mine. And I have seen people go off in a cancel campaign kind of way on an author for not having trigger warnings for a particular thing in their book. And it's like, that means that book was not for you. All you had to do was put it down. And sure, you can review it, but are we really saying that authors shouldn't write about these particular types of content, period? I have a huge problem with that. This is what fiction is for. Fiction is the safest place for us to explore the things that scare us the most. And there's value in having those stories out there. So anyway, like I said, I should have scripted this, but those were my thoughts on that particular comment. And then just to show the flip side of things, here is a dissenting commenter who says, I'm glad you came to your conclusion to warn. I don't remember a TV show with certain things that don't have a warning in the beginning and a helpline number at the end for the last 20 years. That just feels responsible and probably a broadcasting law. How has publishing shirked this for so long? I don't know. Authors and readers have to find their own way. In the end, as an author, you have to live with yourself. As a reader, I lose respect when certain subjects are used as flippant plot points or in an ignorant or insensitive way. Plus, I feel robbed. Books are crazy expensive now. I won't buy from that author again. This is kind of a different, I understand what this person is saying. However, I would say, first of all, there are those resources out there, again, which I will link below, where you can look up a book to see if it specifically has the kind of thing that you find triggering. But as far as whether or not the subject is used as a flippant plot point or in an ignorant or insensitive way, that is usually going to be very subjective as opposed to objective, and this is where criticism comes in. Criticism is great and essential for art, and if something was done in a tasteless or unhelpful or harmful way, that should be part of the discussion, but that is why we have criticism. So I don't think that this is necessarily an argument for trigger warnings so much as it is an argument for literary criticism to continue. But that's just my opinion, and at any rate, I've rambled about this long enough, and I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on this. Like I said, I will put it all in links below in the description and in a pinned comment. And yeah, tell me what you think, and I will see you next week with another vlog.